The morning sun struggled to pierce the thick and freezing mist covering the rolling hills of the Moravian countryside. Thousands of soldiers stood in silence while gripping their muskets with white-knuckled tension as they waited for the signal to advance into the unknown. The cold air bit into their exposed skin, while the sound of distant drums began to echo rhythmically across the valley floor. This was not merely another skirmish in a long line of border disputes, but rather the culmination of years of escalating political tension across the European continent. The fate of empires hung in the balance on this frosty December morning as three great powers prepared to clash in a storm of steel and fire. The stakes could not have been higher for the nations involved in this monumental struggle for dominance. The old monarchies of Europe viewed the rising power of France with a mixture of fear and disdain as they saw their traditional authority threatened by revolutionary fervor. If the French army triumphed on this day, they would effectively dismantle the Holy Roman Empire and rewrite the map of the continent for a generation. A defeat, however, would likely spell the end for the new French Empire and send its ambitious leader into oblivion. Every soldier on the field understood that the outcome of this single day would dictate the future of millions of people from Lisbon to Moscow. At the center of this geopolitical storm stood a man who had risen from obscurity to become the master of Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte was a figure of immense intellect and boundless ambition, who commanded the absolute loyalty of his troops through his charisma and tactical genius. He was not born into royalty, yet he had crowned himself emperor and challenged the divine right of kings with sheer force of will. His mind was constantly racing with maps and logistics as he sought to outmaneuver his enemies before the first shot was even fired. To his soldiers, he was the little corporal who marched alongside them, but to his enemies, he was a terrifying force of nature. How did a minor noble from the rugged island of Corsica manage to bring the great powers of Europe to their knees in such a short span of time? Was it his military brilliance that allowed him to defeat armies twice the size of his own, or was it the disorganized nature of his opponents that paved the way for his success? The nations of Austria and Russia had combined their forces in a desperate bid to crush the French threat once and for all. The question remaining was whether the combined might of the old order could withstand the revolutionary storm that Napoleon had unleashed upon the world. The answer would be delivered on the blood-soaked plateau of the Pratzen Heights, where the French army executed a masterstroke of deception and timing. The Battle of Austerlitz would go down in history as the tactical masterpiece of Napoleon, where he lured the coalition forces into a trap and shattered their center. The victory was total, and the immediate aftermath saw the collapse of the Third Coalition and the establishment of French hegemony over Central Europe. The sun of Austerlitz rose on a new empire, but it also cast a long shadow of war that would engulf the continent for another decade. The triumph was glorious, yet it sowed the seeds of future conflicts. The roots of this conflict stretched back to the chaotic days following the French Revolution, where the established order was violently overturned. France found itself surrounded by hostile neighbors who were eager to restore the Bourbon monarchy and contain the spread of republican ideals. The early wars of the Revolution had forged a new kind of army that was based on merit and national conscription rather than noble birth and mercenaries. It was in this crucible of constant warfare that Napoleon honed his skills as an artillery officer and learned the value of speed and aggression. The revolution gave him the opportunity to rise, and he seized it with both hands. Following his ascension to power as first consul and later as Emperor, Napoleon embarked on a series of reforms to stabilize France. He introduced the Napoleonic Code, which streamlined the legal system and established equality before the law for all male citizens. He rebuilt the infrastructure of the nation and reformed the education system to create a loyal and capable bureaucracy. These domestic achievements provided the stable foundation necessary to support his vast military campaigns abroad. However, his desire for control and legitimacy led him to transform the Republic into a hereditary empire, which alienated some of his earliest supporters who valued liberty above all else. The peace in Europe was fragile and short-lived, as the United Kingdom remained a steadfast enemy of French expansion. The British government used its immense financial resources to fund coalitions against Napoleon and kept the Royal Navy as a barrier against invasion. Napoleon gathered a massive invasion force at the camp of Boulogne, where he drilled his troops relentlessly in preparation for a crossing of the English Channel. He gazed across the water towards the white cliffs of Dover and dreamed of marching on London. The only obstacle standing in his way was the wooden wall of the Royal Navy, which guarded the seas with vigilant determination. The dream of invading England was shattered forever off the coast of Spain at the Cape of Trafalgar. Admiral Horatio Nelson led the British fleet in a daring attack that annihilated the combined French and Spanish navies in a decisive engagement. The battle secured British naval supremacy for the next century and forced Napoleon to abandon his plans for a cross-channel invasion. While Nelson lost his life in the hour of his greatest victory, he ensured that Britain would remain a thorn in the side of France. Napoleon realized that he could not defeat Britain at sea, so he turned his eyes back toward the continent. With the invasion of England cancelled, the emperor wheeled his massive army around and marched them east with unprecedented speed. The campaign of 1805 demonstrated the incredible mobility of the Grand Army as they covered hundreds of miles in weeks. The Austrian General Mack was caught completely off guard at the city of Ulm, where he was surrounded and forced to surrender his entire army without a major battle. This maneuver was a textbook example of strategic warfare, where victory was achieved through marching rather than fighting. The road to Vienna lay open, and the French troops marched into the enemy capital in triumph. Despite the capture of Vienna, the war was far from over, as the Russian army arrived to reinforce the remnants of the Austrian forces. The stage was set for the decisive clash at Austerlitz, where Napoleon faced a numerically superior enemy on ground of his choosing. He deliberately weakened his right flank to tempt the Allies into an attack, while holding his reserves ready to strike the center. The plan worked to perfection as the Allies stripped their center to attack the French right, allowing Marshal Soult to seize the high ground. The resulting rout destroyed the Third Coalition and forced the Austrian Emperor to sue for peace on humiliating terms. The victory at Austerlitz fundamentally changed the political landscape of Germany and led to the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine. This new political entity brought many German states under French protection and signaled the end of the Holy Roman Empire, which had existed for 1,000 years. Prussia watched these developments with growing alarm and decided that it could no longer remain neutral while France dominated Germany. The Prussian army was confident in its legacy from the days of Frederick the Great and believed it could defeat the French upstarts. They declared war on France in 1806 without waiting for Russian support. Napoleon moved against Prussia with the same lightning speed that had devastated the Austrians the previous year. The twin battles of Jena and Austerlitz were fought on the same day and resulted in the total destruction of the Prussian military machine. At Jena, Napoleon commanded the main force, while at Austerlitz, Marshal Davout defeated a much larger Prussian army with a single corps. The French pursuit was relentless, and they captured fortress after fortress until they marched under the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. The swift collapse of Prussia shocked Europe and proved that the French army was currently invincible on the field of battle. With the continent under his control, Napoleon sought to defeat Britain through economic warfare known as the Continental System. He issued the Berlin Decree, which forbade any European nation allied with France from trading with the United Kingdom. The goal was to bankrupt the British nation of shopkeepers and force them to the negotiating table by destroying their economy. However, this policy proved difficult to enforce and caused significant economic hardship for the nations of Europe. Smuggling became rampant, and the system created resentment among the allies of France who relied on British goods. The economic war would ultimately draw Napoleon into disastrous conflicts. The war continued into the freezing plains of Poland, where the Russian army still offered stubborn resistance. The brutal Battle of Eylau was fought in a blinding snowstorm and resulted in a bloody stalemate with heavy casualties on both sides. It was the first time the French army had been checked, and it served as a grim warning of the difficulties of fighting in the east. However, the subsequent Battle of Friedland was a decisive French victory that forced Tsar Alexander I to negotiate. The two emperors met on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River to sign the treaties of Tilsit, which divided Europe between them. Napoleon turned his attention to the Iberian Peninsula, where Portugal refused to comply with the continental system. He sent troops through Spain to invade Portugal, but soon decided to replace the Spanish monarch with his own brother Joseph Bonaparte. This move triggered a massive popular uprising across Spain as the people rose up to defend their king and their church. The French soldiers found themselves fighting a new kind of war against an elusive enemy that struck from the shadows and vanished. This guerrilla war became a bleeding ulcer that drained French manpower and resources for years to come without a decisive victory. The situation in Spain worsened with the arrival of a British expeditionary force led by Sir Arthur Wellesley, who would later become the Duke of Wellington. The British troops proved to be disciplined and effective as they worked in concert with Spanish and Portuguese irregulars. They pushed the French back in a series of battles and provided a beacon of hope for the rest of Europe. Napoleon often underestimated the situation in Spain and left the management of the war to his marshals, who squabbled amongst themselves. The constant drain of veteran troops to the peninsula weakened the Grand Army elsewhere. Sensing French vulnerability due to the Spanish quagmire, the Austrian Empire decided to launch a new war of liberation in 1809. The campaign was much harder than previous ones as the Austrians had reformed their army and learned from their past defeats. The Battle of Aspern-Essling marked the first major defeat for Napoleon personally, as he failed to cross the Danube River under fire. He eventually secured victory at the massive Battle of Wagram, but it was a costly triumph that lacked the brilliance of Austerlitz. Austria was once again forced to sign a punitive peace treaty, but the aura of French invincibility was fading. In search of a male heir and a lasting dynasty, Napoleon divorced his first wife Josephine and married the Austrian Archduchess Marie-Louise. He hoped that marrying into one of the oldest royal families in Europe would legitimize his rule and secure an alliance with Austria. The birth of his son, who was given the title King of Rome, seemed to secure the future of the Bonaparte dynasty. However, the marriage alienated the Russian Tsar, who saw the Austrian alliance as a threat to Russian interests in the Balkans. The relationship between France and Russia began to deteriorate rapidly as both sides prepared for an inevitable conflict. Tsar Alexander I openly broke with the continental system and opened Russian ports to British trade, which infuriated Napoleon. The French emperor felt that he had no choice but to force Russia back into line to maintain his economic blockade of Britain. He began assembling the largest army Europe had ever seen, drawing troops from every corner of his vast empire. Over 600,000 men gathered along the Polish border in the summer of 1812. The Grand Army was a multinational force that included Frenchmen, Poles, Germans, and Italians, all marching under the Eagle standard. The invasion of Russia began in late June, with the French army crossing the Niemen River in confident spirits. Napoleon hoped for a quick and decisive battle near the border that would force the Tsar to surrender. However, the Russian armies retreated deep into the vast interior of their country and employed a scorched earth policy. They burned crops and villages as they withdrew, leaving nothing for the invading French army to forage. The summer heat and disease began to whittle down the French numbers long before they reached the main Russian army. The deeper they marched, the more stretched their supply lines became. The Russians finally turned to fight at the village of Borodino in what would become the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. The battle was a brutal slugging match with little tactical subtlety, as both sides launched frontal assaults against fortified positions. Tens of thousands of men fell in the carnage as cannons roared from morning until night. Napoleon won a technical victory as the Russians withdrew from the field, but he failed to destroy their army. The road to Moscow was open, but the French army was battered and exhausted. The victory had come at a terrible price. Napoleon entered Moscow expecting the city elders to present him with the keys to the city and a request for peace terms. Instead, he found a ghost city that had been largely abandoned by its inhabitants on the orders of the governor. Soon after the French arrival, fires began to break out across the city, which was built mostly of wood. The flames consumed 3/4 of Moscow and left the French army without adequate shelter or supplies for the coming winter. Napoleon waited in the Kremlin for weeks, hoping for a message from the Tsar that never came. With winter approaching and no sign of peace, Napoleon reluctantly ordered the retreat from Moscow in mid-October. The retreat quickly turned into a nightmare as the temperature plummeted and snow began to cover the Russian plains. The French soldiers were ill-equipped for the bitter cold and began to freeze to death in the thousands. Discipline broke down as starving men fought over scraps of food and horse meat. The Russian Cossacks harried the retreating columns, constantly picking off stragglers and preventing foraging. The once magnificent Grand Army was reduced to a column of spectral figures shuffling through the snow. The crossing of the Berezina River was the final tragedy of the campaign, as the French found themselves trapped between converging Russian armies. Dutch pontoon engineers worked in freezing water to build bridges, allowing the remnants of the army to escape. It was a scene of horror and heroism as the rearguard fought desperately to hold back the Russians while panic spread on the bridges. Thousands were left behind or drowned in the icy waters as the bridges were burned to prevent pursuit. Of the 600,000 men who marched into Russia, only a small fraction returned alive. Napoleon left his shattered army and raced back to Paris to suppress a coup attempt and rebuild his forces. His ability to raise a new army in a matter of months was nothing short of miraculous, as he called up new conscripts and stripped other fronts of troops. However, these new soldiers were young and inexperienced, lacking the stamina and skills of the veterans lost in Russia. The cavalry was particularly weak, as thousands of horses had died during the retreat. Despite these challenges, Napoleon prepared to face a new coalition of enemies who smelled blood in the water. The Sixth Coalition formed rapidly as Prussia and Sweden joined Russia and Britain in the war against France. The German states that had been under French protection began to switch sides as the tide of war turned. The campaign of 1813 was fought in Germany, where Napoleon won hard-fought victories at Lutzen and Bautzen. However, his lack of cavalry prevented him from pursuing the defeated enemy and turning these victories into decisive routs. The Allies adopted the Trichenberg Plan, where they avoided fighting Napoleon directly and instead attacked his marshals. The climax of the campaign came at the Battle of Leipzig, which was also known as the Battle of Nations. It was the largest battle in European history prior to the First World War, involving over 500,000 soldiers. The French found themselves surrounded and outnumbered by the converging armies of the coalition. After 3 days of heavy fighting, the French were forced to retreat across the Elster River. A premature destruction of the bridge trapped thousands of French troops in the city, leading to another major disaster. French dominance in Germany was effectively over. The Allies invaded France in early 1814, pressing towards Paris from the north and east. Napoleon conducted a brilliant defensive campaign known as the 6 Days Campaign, where he defeated several Allied armies one after another. He used his interior lines of communication to strike rapidly at separated enemy columns, showing flashes of his old genius. However, the sheer weight of numbers was against him, and his marshals were weary of constant war. The people of France were exhausted, and the calls for peace grew louder with every passing day. Paris capitulated to the Allied forces in late March, marking the first time foreign troops had entered the capital in centuries. The French marshals refused to continue the fight and urged the emperor to abdicate for the good of the nation. Napoleon finally bowed to the inevitable and abdicated the throne in early April at the Palace of Fontainebleau. The Allies granted him sovereignty over the small island of Elba in the Mediterranean and allowed him to keep a small personal guard. The Bourbon monarchy was restored with King Louis XVIII taking the throne. The leaders of Europe gathered at the Congress of Vienna to redraw the map of the continent and restore the old balance of power. They danced and dined in grand ballrooms, while diplomats haggled over territories and borders. The goal was to create a stable Europe where no single nation could ever again dominate the others. They believed that the Napoleonic nightmare was finally over and that peace had returned to the world. However, they underestimated the ambition of the man on Elba and the loyalty he still commanded among the French soldiers. Less than a year after his exile began, Napoleon slipped away from Elba with a handful of men and landed on the coast of France. The news of his return sent shockwaves through the Congress of Vienna and panic through the Bourbon court. King Louis sent the 5th Regiment of the Line to intercept him and arrest the outlaw. When the troops confronted him, Napoleon stepped forward alone and opened his coat, inviting them to shoot their emperor. Instead of firing, the soldiers threw down their muskets and cheered him with wild enthusiasm. The march to Paris was a triumphant procession, as regiment after regiment defected to join their former leader. Marshal Ney, who had promised the king he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, was overcome with emotion and joined him. King Louis fled the capital and Napoleon entered the Tuileries Palace without a single shot being fired in anger. The period known as the 100 Days had begun as Napoleon tried to reassure the European powers that he wanted peace. The Allies, however, declared him an outlaw and pledged to mobilize their armies to crush him once and for all. Napoleon knew that he had to strike quickly before the massive Allied armies could concentrate against him. He decided to attack the British and Prussian forces stationed in Belgium before the Austrians and Russians could arrive. His plan was to drive a wedge between the two armies and defeat them in detail. He marched north with the Armée du Nord, which was composed of devoted veterans who knew this was their last chance. The speed of the French advance caught the Allied commanders Wellington and Blücher by surprise. The campaign opened with twin battles at Ligny and Quatre-Bras south of Brussels. At Ligny, Napoleon inflicted a sharp defeat on the Prussians, causing Blücher to be unhorsed and nearly captured. Meanwhile, Marshal Ney fought a confused battle against Wellington at Quatre-Bras, preventing the British from aiding their allies. The Prussians retreated, but crucially, they maintained their discipline and moved north to stay in contact with the British. Napoleon believed the Prussians were out of the fight and turned his main strength against Wellington. The Duke of Wellington chose to make his stand on a ridge near the village of Waterloo, where the terrain favored his defensive tactics. The morning of the battle was marked by torrential rain, which turned the fields into a quagmire of deep mud. This delayed the French attack as Napoleon waited for the ground to dry so he could maneuver his artillery effectively. This delay would prove fatal as it gave the Prussians time to march to the sound of the guns. The battle began around noon with a massive French assault on the farm of Hougoumont. The fighting at Waterloo was intense and desperate, with the French launching repeated infantry and cavalry attacks against the British line. The British infantry formed squares to repel the French cavalry charges, creating islands of red amidst a sea of blue horsemen. The French artillery pounded the ridge, inflicting heavy casualties, but the British line held firm. Late in the afternoon, the first Prussian troops began to arrive on the French right flank, forcing Napoleon to divert vital reserves. The pressure on the French army was increasing from two directions. In a final gamble, Napoleon committed his elite Imperial Guard to break the British center. The veterans of the Guard marched up the slope in perfect order, ignoring the murderous fire tearing through their ranks. However, they were met by a withering volley from the British Guards, who rose from the tall grass. The Imperial Guard recoiled, and for the first time in history, they began to retreat. The sight of the Guard falling back caused panic to spread through the French army. Wellington waved his hat and ordered a general advance, sweeping the French from the field. Napoleon fled the battlefield and returned to Paris, where he realized that his political support had evaporated. He abdicated for a second time and surrendered himself to the captain of the British ship HMS Bellerophon. He hoped to be treated as a distinguished guest in England, but the Allies were taking no chances this time. They exiled him to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from Europe. There he would live out his remaining years under heavy guard in a damp and windswept house. On St. Helena, Napoleon fought his final battle over his legacy by dictating his memoirs to his companions. He portrayed himself as a martyr for liberty and a victim of British tyranny, shaping how history would remember him. He died in 1821, possibly from stomach cancer, though rumors of poisoning persisted. His body was later returned to France and interred in a magnificent tomb at Les Invalides in Paris. Even in death, he continued to cast a spell over the French nation. The Napoleonic Wars left a deep and permanent mark on the structure of European society. The Holy Roman Empire was gone, replaced by a more consolidated Germany that would eventually rise to power. The ideals of the French Revolution, such as nationalism and liberalism, had been spread across the continent by the French armies. The Code Napoleon remained the basis of law in many countries long after the emperor was gone. The old feudal order had been shaken to its core and could never be fully restored. The conflict was a testament to the power of human ambition and the terrifying cost of total war. It showed how a single individual could rise from nothing to shape the destiny of the world through genius and determination. Yet it also served as a warning about the hubris that comes with unchecked power. Napoleon Bonaparte remains one of the most complex and fascinating figures in history, a man who was both a liberator and a tyrant. His whisper of time still echoes through the modern world, reminding us that history is made by those who dare to seize it.